Huntington welcomes you to the Director's Talk for Teenage Dick, featuring director Moritz von Stulpnagel in conversation with Assistant Director Ashley King. All events at the Huntington include a land acknowledgement. The Huntington acknowledges that our physical spaces stand on the occupied homeland of the Massachusetts people. We begin by acknowledging the Massachusetts tribe, from whom the colony, province, and Commonwealth of Massachusetts have taken their name. We pay respect to the ancestral bloodline of the Massachusetts tribe and their descendants who still inhabit the land to this day. We honor and respect the many Native peoples who are connected to this land, past, present, and future, including the Nipmuc and Wampanoag peoples. And now, the Director's Talk.
Hi, Moritz.
Hey
Long time no
Ashley, how are
see.
you? Long time no see.
I know, right? So for those joining us, this is us in our post-opening glow. This is after we've gotten to really see the show um be fully appreciated by an audience and fully lived in. And for me, this my second opening with this show, but Moritz has now put the show up how many times?
This is now, I suppose, our fourth staging. We did several. Anytime you have like a new play, there's always like this long process of how you actually get it from its first draft, to the stage. And we did several readings that were just to really learn about it and hear it out loud, so that it wasn't just the voices inside our writer's head. And then we did a workshop at the Public, which was sort of semi-staged, and then a full production that was a co-production between Mailly Theater and the Public Theater that's in New York. And then we have now just done it in DC at Woolly Mammoth, and now here at the Huntington, before we head off to Pasadena Playhouse in Pasadena to do it there.
So when you say we, you in my mind, you mean like this core trio of you, our lead Greg, and our playwright Mike Liu. Um, and just because I think the story is so sweet, I love meet cutes. Remind me how you guys met, like how you guys know each other.
Sure. Well, I've known these guys so long that I don't know that we would always describe one another as cute, but Greg Moscala, who plays Richard in the play, he and I were college roommates together. We did a semester abroad in London while we were attending Boston University together, and the whole show essentially was conceived by Greg, who happens to have cerebral palsy and was looking out into the world, seeing kind of a decided lack of roles for people like him. And inside the narratives and stories that he was seeing around characters with disabilities, there was not much variety. I mean, there was often about like kind of overcoming obstacles, or like, in some ways like death with dignity would sometimes be, the kind of sort of dark version if you couldn't overcome your obstacle or whatever. And he thought that was sort of a very limited point of view on the narrative around disability. So he commissioned several writers, one of which was Mike Liu. Mike Liu and I were interns together at Playwrights Horizons in like 20 somehow, and he like kind of continued to like write plays, and we worked together a bunch of times. Greg, Mike, and I, the three of us, did a 10-minute play that Mike wrote about Franklin Delano Roosevelt deciding whether or not he should run for governor of New York, while he was sort of confronting what does it mean to have polio and to sometimes need the assistance of a chair or cane, and would an electorate consider voting for somebody like that, and how could he wrestle his own image in the face of that, and essentially Eleanor Roosevelt sort of snapping him out of his own self-pity, which was an interesting precursor to our play Teenage Dick, which is a transposing of Richard III into a high school, which again, as anyone who's attended high school, so much of it is about image, and where do you rank in the social strata of where you are, and what does your either talents or physicality or how you're perceived, how does that all factor into the identity you create for yourself, and can you take ownership of the identity that you have, or are you at the mercy of how other people see you? So there was like a thematic commonality there, which I sort of am just like now thinking about in some ways. That's sort of how all these things lead together. But so Mike and I have known, and Greg and I have known each other for many years, and it's cool when that happens, because it doesn't, as you know, like often happen in the theater, that you get to work with the same people over and over again. You're
Mm.
sometimes like working thrown into rooms with different groups of people, but when you know one another and you trust one another, a different kind of conversation can have, where you can come up with ideas without having to worry about whether people are going to think they're stupid, or people can tell you the idea is no good, because it's they we all have we know of one another, that we have our best interests at heart. So I can trust that they'll tell me, no, don't do that choice, it's terrible, or whatever it is. And so it allows for a kind of collaboration that is really honest with one another, which
Yeah.
is great when that can happen.
Well, and that's like that's sort of a buzzword among us folks, or what I'm about to say is we talk about like creating the vocabulary of a show, or the community for our rehearsal space. And for myself, walking in, the camaraderie you and the shared vocabulary you and Greg already had sort of helped speed that along for the rest of the room, um, and Shannon as well. Uh, but I wonder where or when was the moment when you were reading the script, or this new where we are now with this script, um, that you personally really felt like you connected with the show in a way that you're like, I know exactly what this looks like now. Where, as opposed where it was like, it sounds like it was this exciting venture with your friends that you were building together, but now you're like, now I, the director, know what I'm creating.
That's a great question. I don't know that I ever like know like with certainty what it is that we're making, but I know that like when I read something, and it's like you get a blueprint when you have a script. It's just text, right? So and that becomes when you key into what exists just there, just in that on the page, you start to feel the potential of something. I don't necessarily know at that moment like what the end result should be, I guess, but I know that there's a potential in it that I feel from who Greg is and the values that he has out of a theatrical experience, and who Mike is and the values he shares in creating a theatrical experience that I want to be a part of. That I sort of, it's a lot like, uh, you know, uh, uh, you can be a choreographer who um, has an idea and casts dancers who can fulfill that perfectly, or you can fall in love with a dancer and the way that they move and express themselves, and yearn to, how do I maximize the vocabulary of movement and expression that their body does, and that their brain or way that they transpose their emotional life into movement can do. And that's exactly sort of like what I get excited about when I read a script, especially Mike's, because I think his language and the worlds that he creates is like so exciting, that I always want to be like, give myself the challenge of, I want to support him in the best way possible. How can I do that? For this play, Mike always has this great idea of leading an audience to believe you're watching one thing,
Mm.
and then challenging them with subverting your expectation of what you think you're watching. So this play, as Richard goes through a series of moral dilemmas, what kind of play you're watching continues to shift. It goes from kind of like a harmless high school, makeover story, to like a kind of rom com, to a darker quest for power, and the potential like brink of badness that you can drive yourself to in the pursuit of that power, and sort of like complete selling out of your moral compass in order to get there, and that shift I think is also really exciting directorially, because it's like, how do we engage an audience? And audiences are really smart, actually. We don't usually give them enough credit to like play that game with us, to
Mhm.
sort of say, you kind of maybe suspected all along that it could go this way, and yet how do I surprise you that it might? That feels exciting to me, and that's sort of like what we were looking to do. So like one example of that was like in scenically, we just wanted to make sure that we could support visually where we think the play is starting. And then as the play goes on and Richard's psyche starts to crack and shift, the set starts to crack and shift and open up and become more theatrical and less realistic. And that becomes sort of a representative of where Richard is psychologically. So that's like, some of the like the challenges we were trying to give ourselves in terms of fulfilling whatever potential we originally saw in the play.
You know, it's I'll say that's one of my favorite things about watching the show, and even having that little break, if you will, in between the DC run, or the last time I saw it in DC and then seeing it again here, is watching, yes, the actor Greg, but also the character Richard go throughout the show, because Greg is so charming, and the the writing for Richard is so charming, and yet it's it's never lying to us, the viewer. And even
It's never
now,
lying
after
to us. Sorry, what did you? It's never
he's never lying to us. You know what I mean? Like, he's
lying.
never
Yeah,
lying to
yeah,
the audience.
yeah.
Um, and so the the not minor spoiler, but like the idea that um you come in, or some people come in with like a basic knowledge of Richard the Third. It's like, why do we not believe he's a villain? Like, how have we infantilized him, or weakened him in some way, just because we're like, because of our perceptions? Um, how and why are we still surprised by the end? And honestly, maybe that's just the gift of Mike's writing and Greg's acting, that they're so charming that you're like, no, you wouldn't do this to me. You would not let me down. You're a good guy. Um, but it also is like the gift of Mike's writing, that challenges at least myself, where I'm like, why am I still surprised by this ending? Like, I know it's coming. And I mean, it's something I really love. My next question. Um,
Well, can I just say to that,
of
because I
course.
love that that is the experience that you're sort of like having, and in some ways, I suppose it speaks to the perception that we have, or how we've been acclimated as audiences to receive stories about disability previously. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's interesting in comparing it to Richard III, because the Elizabethan view of disability is that it is a externalized physical representation of inner moral corruption,
Hmm.
that uh, God or the physics, or have somehow corrupted you physically because of you're corrupted morally. And so there is a kind of Elizabethan repulsion to people with disability in that age. Now, our narratives have acclimated us to feel like, oh, someone with a disability is the underdog. They are the outsider. They are, the person who like deserves our empathy and pity, and et cetera, et cetera, which is a kind of infantilization in a lot of ways, I think. But so when Richard comes on, and he's a kid, and he is excitable, and he tells us he's an outsider, I think we do sort of naturally think, oh, I'm going to root for him. I
Hmm.
hope he like gets there. But as we learn more about who he is and he faces those moral choices, it is challenging to want to root for him to make the correct moral decision, and see him time and again justify to himself that he's looking for power. And where does that come from? He would tell you it's how other people perceive his disability. The character of Buck, who also is a person with a disability, would challenge that and say, no, your disability does not give you the license to be a dick, is what she says in the
Hmm.
show. Um, and so then where else does it come from? Whether it comes from, his own sense of entitlement, and uh, the anger that emerges from feeling like your entitlement wasn't fulfilled, which is something that I think we see like a lot of young men in this country wrestle with. I guess a lot of people, I suppose. But when we look at the violence that we see in this country, a lot of it is perpetuated by young angry men who are trying in some ways to enact some kind of revenge story that they have in their head. And so there is, and we're consistently shocked as much as we see it over and over and over again on the news. It's like we go through this period of like, obviously this is happening again, and gosh, why is this happening again? And I think Mike's trying to engage that question through Richard, and it is shocking because knowing him in the way that we do, and the way that he's so honest and vulnerable with us, we keep hoping he'll make the right decision. Just like we keep hoping so many people in this country make the right decision, and sometimes do and sometimes don't. So it is a challenging, I guess, look at that paradigm that we live in right
Well, it's thinking about other people in our country who've committed gross acts of treason and slaughter. Richard, as a politician, as I was saying before, doesn't lie to us. It's very clear from the opening that it is about power, and ostensibly then what he can do with that power to protect himself. But in thinking about the lack of power that a lot of people on this particular stage have in real life, if we're being honest, it's a stage that beautifully represents a complex community, because we do have people of color and disabled persons, and we really only have one like privileged white male on the stage. Um, how I say this responsibly and respectfully, uh, what for you is the key in to those characters as someone who and for myself, I'm a person who doesn't have a visible disability, so I know that I would have to do my own work and how I would connect with the character. But for you, do you connect with the actors first or the characters first in order to um
now. That's a great question. I mean, I think what we all share coming into the room is a desire to serve the story and a curiosity about how we can best do that. Um, I, having done several productions of this play over many years, I have an instinct about how to do that, and yet I always want to leave room for what does it mean that this person is playing this role, and I'm really grateful that the people that we had in the room felt comfortable enough to feel very open to talk about uh, all facets of that conversation. Um, uh, you know, and I and it is important to me to do whatever I can to create a space that everyone feels safe enough and comfortable enough to engage that conversation, which I don't take lightly or for granted, and hopefully they genuinely have felt comfortable. Uh, but also, inside the play, um, the privilege, privilege is can be broken down into like economic factors, and also factors of perception, what I think I'm owed or due, or don't, what allowances the people around me are willing to afford me, or like, am I actually up against the challenge because people immediately want to be diminutive or reductive or what have you. So, there is there are several moments where the idea of who actually does have privilege comes up in the course of the play, and it is quite nuanced. And sometimes you can agree with a character's point of view, and sometimes you kind of want to smack them for their blind spots. Um, and I think Mike's negotiating that really well, and the cast has done a great job engaging that question. So it's something I would want to know from the audience, like what was their perception watching it, you know?
Yeah, it's I do think it's interesting because I mean, as we talked about in passing and specifically, for some of our characters, and maybe this is the wrong word, it is a coincidence that they're a part of a minority community. Do you know what I mean? It's not integral to their character, and yet the two things can't be separated because these the two women in question will forever be Black women, and of course it informs all your decisions. But I will say, as trite as this may sound, the the thing that makes a room feel so safe um, when you're there, when you're leading the room, is not because you have answers, but because you have the right questions. Because you just keep asking questions that 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 only push people forward. You know what I mean? As opposed to any sort of self-serving reason. I love listening to them. Like have like a new question or like the notes that you give. I'm like, oh, I hadn't thought about that. I'm not sure. Like, you're like, what does this mean?
Well,
I'm like, what does this mean?
I mean, I think that's
Very smart.
incredibly. I think that's incredibly flattering. You know, it's interesting. It comes from just like an ethos of like certainty is, you know, is blocks our ability to speak with one another. Do you know what I mean? Curiosity is the thing that allows us to learn about one another and to see each other and to connect. And once we're certain about the thing we're making or who the other person is, um, that's a recipe for you know, progress and discovery to stop, right? I mean, I don't know that I'm right. I have an instinct, and I can say, "Hey guys, what do you think about this?" But if I say, "Do it my way, I'm right, you're wrong," you know, then it just leads to resentment on other people's part that they can't be included in that, you know. And also, I'm not the one doing it on stage. You know, I'm inviting them to explore an idea or to, you know, find a way to interpret something through their own bodies or and choices or whatever, but I'm not doing it, so they aren't puppets. They're, you know, everyone's a human being and they have to bring as much of themselves as they can. And if they're just being puppets, then it's not satisfying for them and it's not as full for an audience, I guess. But the other place it just comes from is just like, you know, a large acceptance of my own short attention span, you know, and which I'm sort of like being self-deprecating about. But at the same time, it's sort of like if you're losing me, and I'm obviously invested in this, then like why would I expect an audience would care? So you know, anytime I'm watching anything, and the biggest challenge of directing is like, how do I watch it with fresh eyes every time I see it? We've watched it now like so many
Mhm.
times. How do I watch it absolutely fresh every time and stay like in tune with the audience around me of like they're with us, they're not with us, you know, feeling them out. Um, Thankfully for a comedy, the vocal responses make that slightly easier. But even
Mhm.
so, like it's sensing the restlessness in the house or the, you know, the frustration or confusion, just sensing where they are and finding every moment where they're like, here is something's lacking in clarity here. Like there's something I'm getting ever so slightly bored. Why? You know, and that can be really informative. You know, it can be really frightening uh, if you feel a pressure to be certain and know how to fix it. It can be a really informative moment if you take the pressure off and just say, "Huh, that's curious," um, and live in that not knowing for a minute. Um, but I think that's the constant challenge, you know, of watching it over and over again, I guess.
Well, speaking of those laughs, we've now made the show sound like super serious, and it is, but it's not. It's like it's really funny. Um, and and when you talk about like audience reactions, that's been one of my favorite things now that I've had time to like really settle into the piece and like learn these actors' rhythms. Um, to start clocking when people start laughing because it's also when specific people start laughing, not and you can tell who they've sort of connected with. And it's as bright as if they are like threw on a team jersey. Like I'm Team Teacher York. Like they just like they get her and they cackle for all of her lines, or someone who like really connects with Buck and so on and so forth. Um, so now I have to ask you, like just like a classic question. What is your favorite punchline in the show? Oh wait, maybe that's like a giveaway.
I
Hmm.
don't think it's a giveaway because I probably wouldn't answer your your question.
Like I don't
I
have
think it's
one.
a great question, but like what's exciting is that like I I don't I when I'm doing like a comedy, I don't really think of the joke punchlines. Do you know what I mean? Like
Sure.
that maybe comes from just when I watch something that's supposed to be funny, I don't usually laugh at the things that are jokes. I sort of feel like I'm excited to see real human behavior. Like we all of us exist in a world where there's like a layer of like how we present ourselves and how we like behave in the world, and then sort of the inner thoughts of like what the heck is this person saying, or what, like who the
Yeah.
heck is this person, or like this person's nuts, or, like whatever those secret thoughts are, and the way those inner thoughts can be can betray the way we want to present ourselves.
Hmm.
And so like what's exciting to me about Mike's writing is we see what they're all up against in the world. We see a teacher who's like got a bunch of unruly students, or we see Buck who's dealing with her like weird egomaniacal friend Richard, and or whatever it is, or we see Anne who's like being asked out by like this kind of weird dude, and so like the circumstances of that and like the way that they sort of respond to those situations, that's to me what's funny. But
Yeah.
and I just think it's funny the way like we each of us choose to respond to the world around us, and human beings are sort of like incredibly um I don't want to say resilient, but inventive about like how to survive a day.
It's
Considering there's so much nutsomeness all around us that can be incredibly demoralizing and depressing, and devastating on one hand, or just absolutely baffling and confounding on the other, and absurd, really, when you think about it. And yet, like the fact that so many of us just still like find a way to wake up the next day and be like, let's do this again. It's amazing. You know what I mean? Like that act alone is incredible. And so to see how that these characters do that, to me, it speaks to like what you're saying about like we find how we find an alliance with different characters because we're like,
hmm
I've been in that situation, or whatever it is, or that is an exciting way for, if I were in that situation, that's an exciting
How
way
would I
to
respond?
respond. Yeah, exactly. So like that
And
to me is what's interesting.
and maybe I'm biased because I'm around theater folk, and we're just like in general a more demonstrative or heightened and passionate group of people. But I think what I love so much is that uh, just as Richard has his heightened text that shows us that that he's in a different mindset. Um, we have there are characters in the show who don't. You want to say that's not how anyone speaks in real life, and yet it makes perfect sense. Like they're saying things that we would normally only say in a group chat with our like best friends, but you say them. You do say like really outrageous things, and it's so awesome to see like that humanity on stage. To see like maybe the more crude humor, like and juxtaposed with Richard's like soliloquies. Spoiler alert, they're soliloquies. Um, and I don't. Oh wait, that's right. These.
But you'll understand them. I don't think,
Yeah.
I don't think you either need to like know Richard III or, be well versed in Shakespeare talk,
Right.
to like
Well,
receive the play.
and that's also like the true blessing of an actor like Greg is that that also is his strength. Is that language. So um it's all easy to understand and connect with regardless. Um let's see. I I have a million more questions. But
I have a
we have
question for you,
time.
Ashley. Can I ask you a question?
Oh gosh. Okay.
Not to put you on the spot. Is it okay?
Yeah.
Well, I think, like one of the things that's interesting to me about the show and the conceit that Greg and Mike sort of had was, the fact that there's dance in the show. There's a physical life in the show, and you were not only the assistant director but the associate choreographer, working closely with Jen Weber to sort of, construct that. And to me, what's exciting is that a lot of times when someone has a disability, polite society will sort of say you're not supposed to stare at their bodies or the way they're moving or what have you, right? And Greg specifically said, I want dance in the show because I want people to look at my body and look at my movement. As uncomfortable as that may or may not be, I want this show to invite that. And yet, he is on stage with an actor who is an incredible dancer. Cern Villanueva is an incredible dancer. So Greg has experience with movement. It's not that he's like never moved before or whatever, but obviously their two bodies move very differently. And I guess my question for you is like, what is your experience as associate choreographer dealing with people who, not dealing with, but working with people who move differently and might need different things in the rehearsal of things like the dance in the show.
You know, this this may not be the answer that one would expect. Working with Greg slash watching Jen create on Greg and Zern's body was not only that different of an experience from the between the two of them, watching Jen like figure out what looks best on Zern and what looks best on Greg, but also sort of what happens in a lot of rehearsal rooms in my personal experience, because you're always dealing with people of varying skill levels, and I always think it's important that your actors feel comfortable and safe, even if they're like the fiercest ballerinas in the world. That's the only way for your choreography to look good. But I will say that it did force me to, and very quickly, but force me to sort of like check any of my own discomfort and how disrespectful that discomfort is to an actor like Greg or performer dancer like Greg, because it's exactly as you're saying. He is inviting and demanding that you watch this truly captivating performance. It's fierce, guys. It's I mean it's fierce. Um and and it it feels like watching Greg perform feels like that moment that you accidentally make eye contact with somebody and then you find yourself like staring longer and you're like, oh my gosh, am I in a staring match? Like, is one of us allowed to blink? And then all of a sudden it just like melts into comfort. You're like, oh, we're friends now. Like there's that like awkward moment where you're both like daring each other to look away. And then it's like, oh, this was good. This was good stuff. I'm glad we did this. And that's what's also great about the length of the number is that it pushes you through that place of discomfort, if that makes any sense. Um, and I love that Greg, because it's not just his skill level. It's not just that it looks good. It's that he's confident. Genuinely, that he's is just these really these moments of just like pure swagger and confidence. And I love it. I loved all of it, and I also love how it's taught me just to learn more. The uh, Zern's character Anne has a line where she asks Greg slash Richard about what it's like to live at CP, and she says, I'm just obsessed with the way the body moves, and it seems so um, awkward to me, yet so natural to you, and yet so fluid. And all of those things are absolutely true. Where I realize if I stop assuming that the way I do things is correct, then there's like such beauty in like the other ways muscles can be organized and utilized.
That's cool. That's really cool.
Also, Missy Elliott.
Yeah, that was a good
Also,
call. I mean, yeah, I don't regret that choice. Cool. Well, this was really fun. Thank you so much, Ashley,
yeah,
for chatting.
thank you, and thank you to Huntington for letting us reconnect again in this way. And um, I really hope that if you've seen the show already, um, I know you loved it, and I hope this added a little bit more context for you. And if you hadn't yet, I hope we didn't scare you. Anyway, I'll talk to you soon, Moritz.
Okay, great to see
You
you.
guys heard him say it. He will talk to me again.
Yeah.
Bye.